Thank you, Catherine, and thanks everybody for joining us today and our wonderful panel. I'm not going to talk very much at all because you're not here to hear from me. A quick intro to the session and to our speakers. Okay, so, well, 2020, what year? I think it's taught us so much about what really matters to us in life and also how quickly we can make change happen. So I think change has happened to us, but actually there's so many stories of incredible things happening quickly and things changing, so there has to be some opportunity out of this. You know, going back to earlier to the first lockdown this year, for a short time NASA were reporting bluer skies, and I just love that idea of bluer skies. Who could, you know, not want that? Up here in the north, we saw mountain goats move into Llandudno and entertain the world, and across all of Europe, reports of cleaner air and their benefits to health, as well as to our world. So for this session, that leads us to think about our environment, about the beautiful world around us in Wales, our wildlife, our wildflowers, the stunning landscapes, and sunny ones too when we do get a bit of sunshine, and all of the fabulous marine life too. And how do we enjoy that today whilst protecting it for the future and for future generations? And as we learn lessons from the pandemic, there has to be that real opportunity to drive tangible action to protect the world around us, and to do so in a constructive way, a positive way, a way we can engage people to help drive that change. So our panel today, Sophie Howe, Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Sophie has a remit set out in law to be the guardian of the interests of future generations in Wales. She's the world's only Future Generations Commissioner. Fabulous to see Wales leading the way and Sophie leading the way in that. The Guardian describes Sophie as the world's first Minister of the Unborn. Her role is to provide advice to government and other public bodies in Wales on delivering social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being for current and future generations, and assessing and reporting on how they're delivering. Sophie took up the post in 2016. She's led high-profile interventions around transport planning, education reform and climate change, challenging the government and others to demonstrate how they're taking account of future generations. Described by the Big Issue magazine of one of the UK's leading change makers, Sophie's interventions have secured fundamental changes to land use planning, policy, transport schemes and government policy on housing, ensuring that decisions taken today are fit for the future. She has represented Wales at the UN, the OECD, and on a number of international forums. Angela Jones, Partnerships Manager at Snowdonia National Park. Following a BA in History and Welsh History from Cardiff University, Angela taught history for 15 years, including head of department for 8 years, and held roles at the Holocaust Educational Trust, the National Trust, and the National Museums and Galleries of Wales. She completed a master's degree in World Heritage Studies in Brandenburg University of Technology in Germany and Cultural Heritage in Deakin University, Melbourne, whilst working at a number of World Heritage sites globally. Angela finished her thesis through working for UNESCO in Paris, evaluating states of conservation of World Heritage sites in the Europe and North America region. Then as consultant for the Policy and Statutory Meetings Unit in prep for the 43rd session of the World Heritage Committee in Baku, Azerbaijan. Last year, I'm pleased to say Angela returned to Wales to take up the post of Partnerships Manager for Snowdonia National Park, our beautiful national park up here, leading on the development and the production of the new National Park Management Plan. Laurie Frater, Head of Environmental Policy for Welsh Government, was due to join us today. Unfortunately, Mark Drakeford's stolen her away from us, but that does give us more time to ask questions of other people. And if you have any pressing questions for Laurie, please include them in the chat and we will follow up with the answers from her. I'm sure Laurie will join us at a future event. And last but certainly not least, Noreen Blanluet. I've been practicing pronouncing Noreen's surname, hopefully got that right. Noreen's Director of Co-Production of Network for Wales. She's a biologist and a systems thinker by training. Prior to founding and growing the Co-Production Network for Wales, Noreen works in a wide range of organisations, from micro companies to corporate multinationals in the private and the third sector. Noreen is an experienced coach, a facilitator and convener, and this has been working as a co-production trainer and consultant, helping organisations shift to a more relationship-centred approach, all of which really helps drive change. She's interested in complexity, resilience, leadership, nurturing diversity and building community. Noreen's role is to support change makers of all kinds working towards a common vision, that of a fairer and more sustainable Wales, where everyone has a voice. I kind of feel a bit like the start of question time here, so welcome to our panel. It's absolutely wonderful that you've taken the time out and everybody doing this on a pro bono basis for us, so really, really grateful. Enough of me, over to Sophie. And Sophie, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about how we can all make a positive contribution to protect the environment for today, to enjoy it today and for future generations. Sophie.
It's lovely to be here, with you, and to be talking about this really important topic, which is coming quite timely, because we're actually on the sort of year countdown to the next big climate change discussions, negotiations, which are being hosted by the UK next year in Glasgow. And they will be really critical, because we've all heard about the Paris climate change commitments to keep global warming 1.5 degrees and so on, but actually in terms of the kind of solid commitments that have come beyond that kind of that overarching commitment, the solid commitments aren't really demonstrating the necessary actions to get us towards keeping global warming at that level. So it's more important than ever that that everyone across the world, and sometimes you think, well, Wales is a small nation, how can we compete, and it doesn't matter what we do, it's what China and what the US and so on are doing. But actually in many cases, it's actually the small states and regions who are leading the most progressive action on climate change and environmental sustainability. And of course, as you've heard there, Wales is still the only country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations, and the only country in the world to have a future generations commissioner overseeing that the implementation of that legislation. Why do we need to legislate to protect the interests of future generations? You'd think it would be something that instinctively everyone would want to do. In fact, the minister who passed the legislation described it as a common sense act, but I often sort of say common sense, unfortunately, isn't often that common. And it's basically all centered around the fact that our whole approach to policy making, decision taking is short term. We have short-term political cycles, short-term budget cycles. Politicians tend to just be interested in what's going to get them elected next time round. And when we talk about kind of my role and the role of the sort of Future Generations Act, people will often say, oh, well, is it all about kind of forecasting and future trends and scenarios and so on, and how can you possibly predict the future? And of course, again, we know that actually most future trends and scenarios are they're not that accurate. But actually, I don't think it is about kind of being a bit of a mystic Meg and forecasting the future as such, because there are very many things that we know are pretty much certain to happen, and we are still not taking enough action on them. And of course, climate change and ecological resilience, enhancing and maintaining our biodiversity is one of those areas. So we have done more damage to the planet and put more carbon into the atmosphere since Al Gore published his first Inconvenient Truth on climate change than at any other time in human history before that. So we've done that knowingly. I think that the approach that is often taken is one of kind of willful blindness, because the decisions that we need to take are kind of too difficult and too hard and damage too many vested interests. But we do have this legislation in Wales. It is making a difference. I suppose, you know, many of you will know of the sort of, you know, the big test case around the changing decision on the M4 relief road, but also due to our legislation and interventions from myself and a range of other brilliant committed campaigners. Last year we saw the biggest single increase in direct action for climate change. We've seen commitments around a national forest. COVID recovery now is very much centred on a green and just transition. So there are loads of opportunities there. But I think, you know, in terms of our everyday life, we should all be thinking about what we need to do to support that. So whether that's, you know, lobbying and campaigning, the fact that climate change is now, you know, prior to sort of COVID, it was the #1 issue of concern. So it was even above, you know, the health service and so on, which has traditionally been the big issue of concern. But, you know, that is really helping to change the government approach and action in this area. So please keep kind of, you know, lobbying, you know, campaigning, talking to your politicians and so on. But also please think about the things that you can be doing in your own personal life. In the run up to Christmas now, for the first time last year, I decided that I wasn't going to buy any new Christmas presents for my younger children. So everything was, you know, part of the circular economy. I had a wonderful time meeting many people, collecting bits and bobs that were pre-loved for the children's Christmas. There was quite a funny occasion where my husband answered the door and came in and said, "There's a woman at the door for you with a bag of cats." And he was kind of like, what is going on here? But actually, you know, small actions like that, you know, trying to walk and use public transport wherever you can, you know, thinking about food waste, where we source our food from.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the green and fair transition that you referred to?
Yeah, so in terms of the approach to COVID recovery, and we hear a lot. I think the kind of UK government mantra is, you know, let's build back better. I'm not a fan of that, because just doing the same things that we've always done before a bit better, I don't think is going to get us to where we need to be in terms of reversing the decline of nature and meeting our climate change carbon emissions targets. So we need to be thinking sort of fundamentally differently. So back in May, I published a 5-point plan around COVID recovery, which was basically to focus on investing in skills and jobs in the green economy. So, you know, who are going to be our renewable energy technicians of the future. Let's learn from other countries where, in Pakistan, for example, they're taking furloughed or redundant workers and getting them to plant trees. There are opportunities in those sorts of industries for many people in Wales. Let's make sure that those skills and those, that we're investing in those industries to create those jobs, but we're also getting into the sort of skills pipeline there to make sure that when these green jobs do emerge, that we haven't just upskilled a load of white men to do those jobs. Let's be focusing on how we can make sure that their diversity is kind of baked in from the outset. And then I think in retrofitting energy efficiency measures and so on into homes is such an obvious thing to do, because we invest in that area and we create jobs undertaking that energy efficiency, doing the fitting of new boilers and so on.
Introduced Angela a little bit earlier, Angela with Snowdonia National Park. So yeah, can you tell us a bit more about sustainable tourism, Angela?
Yeah, well, thank you, Michelle. We've actually recently had a debate here amongst ourselves about what we think sustainable tourism is, and a review, if you like, of where we were heading, based on everything that's happened this year. What is it that we really want to see, and what should we call it? Is it responsible tourism, eco-tourism, balanced tourism, and all of these other definitions that exist? And really, we just keep coming back to the same thing. What we're after is an encouragement of tourism which understands deeply, hopefully, the area that is being visited and is of benefit to the land and its inhabitants, which obviously includes the people who live and work in that place that's being visited. I mean, for sake of reference, we do use, officially the UN World Tourism Organization's definition of sustainable tourism, which is that tourism that takes full account of its current and future economic, social and environmental impacts, addresses the needs of visitors, the industry, the environment and host communities. But, that's, what does that look like? I honestly believe that sustainable tourism is ultimately about good tourism management. And I acknowledge my position of privilege really in saying that, making that statement, because as you mentioned, I've worked in many other environments. And I think that good tourism management is something that is achievable here in Wales and potentially not in other places, so we are in that privileged position here to have that as an aim. And also, of course, my role is partnerships manager, so I think that this should be done in partnership with all communities and sectors who are involved. And I can say that really from experience, because as you mentioned, I've just led on the production of the new National Park Management Plan, which is called Cynllun Eryri. Cynllun is plan and Eryri is Snowdonia in Welsh. And for this, the National Park Authority has actually moved into a totally new way of working, and it's been co-produced in the true spirit of partnership with a whole host of organisations and communities and different representatives of all the sectors across the area here. And it's been pretty groundbreaking, really, for the authority to give that level of control over to partnership for a statutory management plan. It is required to have. But you know what? It's really worked. It's really worked. And the action plan has a set of objectives that have been set by those who live and work here and take care really of this landscape on a daily basis together. And that has not been an easy process. I mean, don't let me gloss over that. Getting all of those people together in agreement is obviously challenging. And that was a process that was begun a couple of years even before I came back to and started this position. So there was a lot of consultation and a lot of getting people into the room. And it was interesting because my current line manager who started this process, when I spoke to her about, well, how did you manage to crack that? She said, well, ultimately, when you get people to sort of say what they want to see in the future, everyone is really after the same thing, and they're after something that's bigger than them, that's bigger than their organisation, and it's about the future of this wonderful area and the people that live in it, and obviously the biodiversity and the habitats and the amazing, internationally renowned species and habitats that we have here. So it has required a lot of listening, but we just came to proof this plan after the whole events of the summer. Because it was due to be officially adopted in April, but now it had to be delayed until September. And when we actually sort of re-looked at the action plan to think, is it still relevant? Is it still fit for purpose? We haven't changed a thing, and I think that that's because of the sustainable way that it was created. So ultimately, all of these people saying this is what they want to see over the next 5 years, this is how we're going to work together to achieve it, has been so empowering for everyone and has made the targets and in that action plan really, really robust. And I think maybe it's just important for a moment to kind of pause and realise that we're quite ahead of the game here in Wales on that kind of approach, because as I said, I came back to this position from working overseas and in similar environments in different countries. And I remember holding the first partnership meeting and being quite intimidated by the whole thing, but just like, wow, what a celebration that we've got all of these people here who are prepared to work together and get this done ultimately and see this kind of, this long-term goal and this long-term aim. So yeah, anyway, that's possibly just something an aside. But just to mention, I mean, you may be aware that we've had a fairly high profile issue with tourism and over tourism before and directly after the sort of main period of lockdown this year. And that's accelerated our long-term vision in culinary to make sure that this area, this outstanding area, now becomes an internationally recognised exemplar of sustainable tourism. And even before the pandemic, there was a general feeling that, to quote Mark Drakeford, doing nothing is not an option. You know, it really had got to that point really before even the pandemic was on our radar. But now that has become a catalyst ultimately to what we want to achieve here. So we now, just this week actually, have been sort of publicly releasing this parking and transport strategy. It's quite groundbreaking, you know, and it's become a bit of a reality over the last couple of weeks because the core partners have agreed to it. And it's going to be a total mindset shift really in how everyone approaches the area, how people move around the area, and it's based on a really strong sustainable tourism model. And the beauty of the whole thing is that we've got the idea of an overall strategy, and the partners, if you like, have now bought into the overall vision. But it doesn't move ahead until we have a series of community master planning workshops, and that's the absolute core of it, you know. So that's the next couple of steps, is here's what potentially could happen, and we've got the big picture. We've been lucky enough to have support from Welsh Government and start progressing some of the initial projects with Transport for Wales. So we can go to these master planning events with some, you know, some ideas, some practical ideas then. But ultimately, how that looks in the long term and how that develops is completely down to this kind of idea of master planning and master planning together, and communities really shaping how they want to see that in the future. So I'm talking a lot, but I just wanted to maybe say that this has also been influenced by, because Sophie just mentioned sort of looking for good examples overseas and good practice. We've had the influence from a system in Austria. And that's been a kind of heavy inspiration for this model that we're sort of looking at the moment. And one of the fantastic things about that model, when we've learned about it, is that it actually encouraged in that area young residents to move back to the region because it had a very different kind of economic model, and so it encouraged kind of the entrepreneurial approach and different business models to be possible. And that, as you know, in sort of rural areas in Wales is a massive issue, that, you know, we lose a lot of our young people to obviously, you know, the bigger cities and to other areas. So that's something that, you know, we're really keen to promote as well. So yeah, you know, what is sustainable in tourism? It should encourage responsible tourism, high quality, authentic visitor experiences, minimising the impact on environment and climate, of course, and be inclusive. So yeah, sorry, I've talked a lot, but if in summary, I think sustainable tourism is a process that needs to be constantly reviewed. But ultimately, in my opinion anyway, it's a way of working together to welcome people to places in a way that's accessible for all and for the benefit of that place and for the visitor.
Thank you, Angela. And for us as individuals, whether we're visiting Snowdonia National Park or other parts of our wonderful country, you know, what does a responsible tourist look like? What should we do? And in particular, perhaps, what should we avoid doing?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've had a tough time over the last few months, as I'm sure everyone's aware, in terms of how local communities have reacted to visitors and how visitors have reacted to this area as they've returned as well. It's been challenging. And I think one of the words that keeps cropping up is respect, you know, and that sort of encompasses the whole ethos really from both sides, you know, that obviously communities could respect tourism and respect tourists that come in, but obviously we've had sort of, there's phrases being bandied about by the sort of like a new tourist that's been coming into sort of designated landscapes, etc., that may not have necessarily done that before. But there's respect for people who live here and for the way of life ultimately as well. So I think that responsible tourism is about making better places for people to live in and better places for people to visit ultimately. And it's about responsibility, you know, it's about taking responsibility. And of course that depends where you are in the world, and you know, being aware of the environment and the culture of that place is extremely important. But I think some of the things that we can all look to do, doesn't matter where you are really, is try and first of all, you know, stay there for a while. In most places would encourage, rather than day tourism or just sort of, you know, the in and out sort of type of tourism, to try and stay there at least overnight, if not for a little bit longer. That helps local businesses, obviously hotels, etc. And by doing that, really probably the second big thing is support the local economy. Even if you aren't staying overnight, you know, to do go to local restaurants, pubs, cafes, buy souvenirs, gifts, visit local markets, use a local tour guide if you can, you know, pretty much anything local really, because your money is then going back to the community rather than obviously big organisations. I mean, I would encourage exploring non-popular areas as well, and again, possibly that's about planning in advance, you know, rather than just expecting to turn up somewhere and things to be available. Have an idea of where you're going, and a backup plan ultimately. You know, if that place is looking extremely busy in this context, then it is too busy, so don't, you know, try not to go and add to that. Please try and have a backup plan that you've got somewhere else to visit. And recently I've heard this phrase, and I'm sure some of you have heard it before, but I really love it, which is become a temporary local, not a tourist. And I think tourist has got some negative connotations now, unfortunately, and I don't think it should, you know, probably unwarranted, but that's a lovely idea of becoming a temporary local. I mean, I'm sure, you know, you all know that here in Eryri, you know, most people speak Welsh, you know, as their first language. And even I lived in Cardiff for 20 years, and you know what I would do there is start my conversations in English with people. Somehow you work out that they speak Welsh, you switch to Welsh. But here it's totally the opposite, and that's even taken me a bit of a mindset shift. You know, everyone here starts their conversations in Welsh, and then we'll switch to English if obviously people can't speak Welsh. You know, so even just kind of learning a few words of whatever it is the local language. Think about dress codes. You know, think about you know, all of those sorts of things. Read around. You know, it's easy for us all to do that these days, obviously with access to the internet. And similarly to what Sophie said, you know, minimise transport, take public transport if you can. You know, that's one of the things I would complain about here in Wales. Again, having travelled the world on my own and being able to get good public transport in most of the places, I think we've got a long way to go here, you know, so hopefully that's improving. And in general, in the world, I mean, you know, then things like don't take away sort of natural souvenirs, or, you know, be careful what you're buying, you know, and obviously if that's got ethical implications as well. But particularly don't litter. I mean, I know I'm speaking to the converted here for sure, but you know, that's absolutely essential. And when we reopened the national park, if you like, after the main lockdown, we had a campaign which needed a good comms message, and you usually use the rule of 3 in your comms message, and ours was be safe, tread lightly, and be kind. And I think that those 3 things just kind of summarize it really. You know, be safe, obviously because of the coronavirus kind of context, so obviously social distancing, etc., maintain safe distances. But you know, that's relevant for us all the time because our mountain rescue teams are volunteers. So being safe, being aware, you know, not putting them at risk or putting yourself at risk and other people around you is important always. Tread lightly speaks for itself, you know, that's that respect, isn't it? Respecting the area, the community, the environment. While in that context, wildlife had shifted, you know, during our lockdown period, and we had a lot more ground nesting birds closer to pathways and, you know, etc., etc. But, you know, what we mentioned about changing your destination, have a few options, have backup plans, and then be kind. Well, you know, just in terms of, we were asking people to try and park in designated spaces. camp in designated spaces, because that is something that we did see this summer, a lot of people just sort of turning up and camping, you know, wherever. And then just be careful where you're parking in front of people's entrances to their houses, etc., etc. So yeah, I think that you know, from a Snowdonia National Park perspective, maybe that summarises that responsible tourist approach is be safe, tread lightly, and be kind.
Thank you, Angela. That's I love that idea. The kind of be safe, tread lightly, and be kind. I think that's something we can take into all different parts of our life, as well as protecting the environment. So thank you very much. Okay, let's go over to Noreen. Noreen, how do we engage local communities in constructive action? We've just heard from Angela on the importance of that engagement in many ways. So yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Prananda. Thank you everyone for being here and for your time and presence. I'm going to speak probably from more of a, when I say we, how do we engage local communities in constructive action? I'm thinking as organizations, whether we're charities or statutory organizations or private even, how do we actually make that link and build those relationships with local communities to find out what people are thinking and what their wishes are and what their visions of the future might be. And I think my bottom line with this is listen. We need to get much better at listening. This is not something we do very well. And we tend to go in with ideas and solutions and plans and strategies. But actually, before we do that, it matters to take the time to hear what people's lives are like and what they care about and what's important to them and what does a good life, a good neighborhood, a good society look like for them, and start the conversation there. And I get that it can be frustrating for organizations because people want to talk about things like, the most common complaints I hear is people want to talk about dog poo and about parking. And we want to come in and talk about, you know, safety for older people, or we want to talk about what do we do about climate change, or we want to talk about these big strategic, challenging environmental and social and economic problems, but people want to talk about dog poo. But if we come in and say, we want to really listen to what you say, but only if you talk about the stuff that matters to us. It's a really disingenuous approach. And we've got to actually genuinely listen to what matters to people. And if we listen to the dog poo conversation and engage with that, actually, we're going to find that it's about how people care about their neighborhood and how it looks like, and actually how safe it might be, or how hygienic it might be. And actually, is there spaces? Are there parks? How are they used? Are people walking? How is that tapping into the local health and well-being and exercise? How is it tapping into loneliness? People who walk dogs make friends with other dog walkers. There's this whole little society of people who make friends because they see each other at the same time on their dog walking routine. There's a whole microcosm around dog poo that actually taps into answering questions like, how do we make use of our green spaces? How do we connect with nature? How do we reduce loneliness? How do we get people more active? So if we start with the conversations where they will feed into these big strategic concerns that we are tasked with solving. So let's start listening better and with a bit more openness, a bit more humility to actually hear what's there and take the conversation from there. The other thing is, the next step from that, I suppose, is let's find out what's already happening. Because quite often we're tasked with, you know, solving a problem. And so we'll design a solution and we'll implement it. But actually there might already be people just down the road in this community who've already done things that either answer this completely or answer a part of this. But there's a tendency for organizations to have, you know, the strategic plans with the specific timelines and the budgets and the timescales, and we just need to do this in the next 12 months, and we just roll it out, and not noticing that we're either duplicating or that we're crushing something that's already happening locally. There's a whole bunch of considerations that sit behind this in terms of how things are commissioned, how things are funded, the sort of timescales we work out. Some of these things we can't necessarily do anything about. Some of those things are out of our gift, but within the sphere of what we can influence and control, can we actually map what's already happening on the back of those conversations with local communities, what already exists, and how can we support and enhance that rather than trying to duplicate it? And my next the next step of the journey after that is, well, once we found the stuff that's happening locally, because that community action probably exists in lots of different forms, how can we support it and let's not take over? There's a risk always that we can come in and crush things through over bureaucratizing them, but let's support what communities are really good at doing, which is being flexible and adaptable and responsive on the front line, really meeting local needs. And so if we as organizations can come in and support that, because that's the bit that we can't do with the weight of our administration and size of the organization, that actually we get the best of both worlds. We can support and consolidate, but we can enable local people to do what they do best. And that, in a nutshell, is involvement, is co-production, is meaningful community engagement. So the way to engage with local communities in constructive action is finding out what people care about and helping them do something about it. It will dovetail with what we're trying to do, but it will enable us to make much better use of the resources and the energy and the commitment that already exists in our communities that we don't make anywhere near enough of at the moment.
Wow, what a lot you covered there in a short space of time, Noreen. Thank you. I think with each of our speakers today, I just feel we could talk all day. So thank you all for keeping it relatively brief in such a way that we've got time to take some questions to the panel. Sophie, welcome back. I know you were parked up right at the beginning and not driving, just in case anybody was worried that might be the case. Hopefully we'll be able to hear you as well as our other wonderful speakers again now. So we'll go to questions, we'll start off with people asking their own questions. We'll see how our time's going. We might shorten it with me jumping in and asking them towards the end. But Jen Ramsey, if you'd like to unmute yourself, I know you had a couple of questions for Sophie.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask my first question. There was two questions, Soph, because Noreen's basically just sort of taken, well, I'm just in awe of her, actually. She's just answered it over and over again in a million different ways. So thank you very much, Noreen. But the second question, I suppose, was about the green footprints of our leaders. So there's been some talk, and my husband has been sort of leading some discussion on this, but it hasn't really gone any further at the moment, about MSs perhaps publishing their own green footprints and showing people their air miles, for example, their mileage, to give a better sort of presentation to the people that this is a priority. So I just wondered if this is something you think may have some sort of merit, obviously in an early way, in terms of better demonstrating to people how leaders are obviously committed to climate change and environmentalism. And is there anything else that we could be pushing for in their sort of immediate future as a you know, sort of immediate priority to start with? I think so.
Yeah. Hi, Jen. Really good question. And yes, I think absolutely they should. So I publish the, you know, my carbon footprint. We offset our carbon footprint, which is, you know, not absolutely ideal. Obviously, the ideal scenario is to be reducing your carbon footprint, which we are in many areas, but where, you know, we do still have that carbon footprint, we offset it. I also think, you know, there are, so I don't see any reason why other leaders shouldn't be asked to, you know, to do that. They, you know, have to publish their expenses and all manner of other things. And I think in this, you know, in this world where, you know, climate change is the, you know, the big issue in front of us, then it would seem reasonable for that to be done as well. And I also think that there are things that, you know, they can do as employers, you know, with the help of the, you know, the Senate Commission and so on. So, you know, as an example, you know, in my office we have a pool bike. So, you know, for, you know, local meetings and so on, there's a bike in the office that people can use. We give the same mileage, and actually we're going to swap it around. So to give more mileage we actually pay mileage for bike travel. And I would like to move that to actually paying more mileage for bike travel than for car travel. So that's a sort of incentivization. We offer the sort of interest-free loans to buy public transport season tickets. The car which I've had to drive this morning to get to an appointment is a lease scheme through our office, where we have an ultra low emission vehicle lease scheme, which means I can drive an electric, fully electric car. So there are loads of those things that can happen, that employers can do. We have a plastic cup ban in our office. We think about where we procure our our resources from. So our toilet paper, for every toilet roll we buy, we're buying funding sort of toilets in sub-Saharan Africa, and there are loads of things, and if you just think about it, that can be done, and really the politicians and others should be leading the way on that, I think.
That's really helpful, and I think those examples are things that we can think about in our own lives at home as well as what everybody's doing in their professional lives. Marianne Brocklesby, you have an interesting question. Lots of interesting questions coming along. Would you like to ask that?
Hi, Sophie. Hi, I totally agree with what you were saying on building back fairer, building back differently, building back exclusively. And I wondered where in that vision fitted in how we deal with food insecurity and food systems, particularly as we know children, women, people of colour, people who are differently abled are disproportionately affected by access to nutritious food that's affordable. How are you looking at that, and how are you looking at it in terms of the green economy and the green recovery?
Yeah, really important point, and I think COVID has really kind of exposed and perhaps brought a bit more into the public consciousness as well, this sort of this big issue around food insecurity. I published what's called Future Generations Report. Each commissioner has to publish it every 5 years. It's got a series of recommendations in there. One of the recommendations is that there is a food system strategy developed in Wales to connect all of these things and to look at issues around food security. How do we grow food sustainably? How do we do that in a way which also tries to get good quality sustainable food to those people who most need it, and so on and so on. So that is a recommendation to government, which I'm waiting for a response to. But we've also been working with the government around procurement, and there's some work going on now in terms of the foundational economy, with the I don't know if you've heard of them, they're called CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and this is work that's been taken forward by Lee Waters. And the focus of the look at procurement there in terms of how could we do procurement better is around food. So the idea with that is how can we get all of our public service boards, for example, and the constituent parts of them, which are all of our public bodies spending millions, billions of pounds actually, not just on food but on a whole range of things. How can we get them procuring that food sustainably and looking for those kind of multiple benefits in the way that they go about doing that?
Thank you. And we have a question from Noreen from Georgia Marks. Georgia, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, in terms of co-production and engagement that we were discussing, how do you make sure that we involve all groups? How can you make sure that this engagement is properly inclusive?
Great question. Thanks, Georgia. My nutshell is going to be do as much as you can to begin with. Start pushing the open doors, reach out to the people you know, reach as far as you can with what you've got. Don't expect it to be perfect immediately, but also bear in mind that co-production and involvement, they're developing an ongoing relationship. They're not task and finish. So you might not have everybody in the room in the first conversation, but at every time you get everyone together, you can go, who's not here? Whose voice is missing and how can we reach out? Use your networks of networks and spread it organically that way, because as the journey develops, then people will come and join the conversation. At the beginning of this kind of journey, if there isn't historically, a strong relationship of trust and ongoing interaction, then not very many people will turn up, because there's lots of consultations. People are very busy. There's lots of demands on their times. Why should they do this rather than something else? So you'll have the keenies who will come, the people who are really interested, and they'll show up. And with this kind of work, the right people, the people who show up are always the right people you need to have in the room. They're self-selecting, they're committed, they're passionate, they're interested in what's going on, and they can help you spread the word. So every time you talk to people, have that bit of the conversation saying, okay, who else can you help us reach? Who should be here? Who's not here? And how do we make this really properly diverse and inclusive? This is an ongoing journey for us. It's important for us as organizations to have that openness and that transparency, not being worried about asking for help and saying, you can reach people that we can't reach. Can you help us put the word out there? They'll be better coming from you than it comes from us. And actually having that humility of saying, we don't have all the answers, but together we can figure it out and we can make sure the right people are here.
Thank you, Noreen. And Georgie, while we have you, I think you had a question for Sophie as well.
Yeah, I do. So the question for Sophie is, obviously bearing in mind that all of the wellbeing goals interlink, how can an environmental future advance equality for all protected characteristic groups? And that, includes women from all backgrounds. What steps can we take to advance equality whilst also advancing a green recovery?
Yeah, great question. I'm actually just about to commission some work on sort of, part of the commission will be on exactly that question. What are the equality implications of some of the key future trends facing us here in Wales, of course, of which climate change is one. We'll probably also look at the ageing population and automation and artificial intelligence as well, because we know that all of these things are, most of them are gendered in some way or t'other. If you haven't read the book Invisible Women, I'd really encourage you to read that and find out why snow clearing is gendered and why more money gets spent on roads, which benefits predominantly men who go from their house in their car to work and back again, and isn't meeting the needs of women in terms of public transport. Is certainly not meeting the needs of women. It also operates on that kind of hub and spoke model, whereas we know the women need to drop the kids off, go and look after an elderly parent, do the shopping, and have all of these sort of different trips and so on. But I think in terms of the kind of, the green recovery and so on, I mentioned the issue about green jobs, and, I have been challenging the government around that. And just looking at the chat now, I saw Emily posted around the gender pay gap in green jobs. And this is exactly my concern, because we can put a load of investment in creating, in those industries of the future, those green industries, and create jobs in those areas. And that's great. But unless we've done the hard yards up front to make sure that the people going into the apprenticeship courses and gaining the skills in those areas are targeted at a diverse range of people, we'll actually just be exacerbating inequality. I think that there are things, however, where we can be thinking that there are likely to be some equality benefits. So again, the target around the 30% of people working from home. I think that I think it's probably we probably could go further than that. But the new norm in terms of working from home could potentially be a game changer for disabled people, for example. Could be a game changer. I mean, certainly, I'm feeling this myself, and doing the school run and so on with other mums. It's a game changer for many of them, not having to do that commute. They're riding to school on their bikes with their kids, whereas they were previously, getting in their car and chucking the kids out to, breakfast club and doing all these things because they're on such a sort of mission to have to get into the office by 9 o'clock and so on. So I think there's loads of kind of potential around that as well. But what we need to do is we need to take that equality lens to everything that we're thinking about in terms of the in the green recovery, and we need to do that in practice rather than just in narrative. Because again, as I said, my challenge to the government is it's all very well and good saying this, but actually, inequality or equality doesn't just emerge by itself. We actually have to put in place some targeted interventions to make sure that we're not in the way that we go about doing things, you know, exacerbating existing inequalities and so on.
Thank you, Sophie. And Angela, I have a question from me for you actually. Within the national park, what changes have you seen in relation to wildlife and wildflowers over this year? We had that very long period of lockdown to begin with. I certainly seem to see more butterflies this summer at home. But what's the experience within the national park?
Yeah, we actually commissioned somebody to go out and do a series of biodiversity studies for us, because we were hearing all of this stuff that you referred to at the beginning about, you know, the air being, or the sky being bluer, the air being cleaner. And we thought, you know what, we actually need to get that down. If that's true, we need to go and measure it. And it was true, basically. Yeah, we sent out one of our trusted sort of biodiversity survey guys, and he went to the core areas, especially obviously the Snowdonia, the mountain, and did a series of studies, and it was super interesting. And what we saw was more ground nesting birds on and close to paths, which we would never usually have seen, you know, before. And also the rate at which the flora and fauna recovered and grew over those areas as well was quite phenomenal. And then interestingly, things like we've got a set of herring gulls that nest quite close to the summit of Snowdon, because they know they're going to kind of get their scraps and their chips and whatnot from everybody going up there, and they actually moved away. So we lost them completely, because, you know, their food source up there had disappeared. But probably two things I think were most noticeable, and this is probably what we had the most feedback on, was that the tranquility and solitude, that feeling of solitude, was obviously much more achievable during that period, and obviously locals were able to experience that. And, you know, one of the things very practically that we really noticed was a massive reduction in litter that was available when that was very observable when people weren't in the equation, you know, that's quite a negative and a sad place to end in, but, you know, that's probably one of the biggest impacts that we saw actually. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, as we're getting towards the end of the session, first of all, thank you everyone for attending and for all the questions. I kind of wish we had all day to do this. Catherine, so handy time to hand back to you, because I saw, Catherine, you have a question as well. So I'll hand back to you to end, but perhaps you could ask your question first.
Oh, great, thank you, Jock and Val, Michelle, and thank you also to all the panelists. It's brilliant to have you here. I was really struck by the point that Emily Durant put up in the notes, actually. A really great report from Nesta looking at different ideas around the green recovery and gender. But my question was, just to end up, just to finish off, is what can we keep from this? Obviously, this pandemic has been horrendous. But what is there anything positive that we can keep, apart from, Sophie already mentioned the working from home, which obviously reduces emissions and so on, but what do Noreen and Angela think about one positive thing that we should keep and take forward? Thank you.
Angela, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, probably because I'm heavily involved in parking and transport at the moment, I think that's one thing that communities all around this area and that we've heard about needs to improve is better, especially to rural communities, better public transport systems. And people are happy to use it, and they were even happy to use it when people returned after lockdown, despite the fact that obviously, you know, people felt less safe, if you like, on public transport because of the proximity to the people. But, you know, well-organised, good public transport systems, really a massive need for people who are feeling you know, unconnected then and more isolated. I think that the experience has really, you know, emphasised that feeling of isolation. So
thanks, Angela. So public transport is key. Noreen, over to you.
I would say something that's been amazing is this kind of interaction, that actually we can be all over the place in great numbers without the cost and the time and the environmental footprint of lots of travel, and being able to jump into lots of collective debate and action. And so that working remotely or from multiple locations has been a real positive and a fast learning curve for a lot of us in a very positive way. And I guess my caveat is there's a huge also element of digital exclusion that balances this digital inclusion. And so if we had, that comedy Maslow pyramid where Wi-Fi is that like the bottom layer of the, if we could have universal access to data, internet, Wi-Fi for free or for, as part of one of the basic necessities of life, then actually that would be a huge boon for all of us.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I remember learning about that in my earlier days, and yeah, I hadn't, obviously Wi-Fi didn't exist then, and but of course now it does. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Sophie, to Angela, and to Noreen, but also to Michelle, who has masterminded or mistress-minded this whole event. And planned it, and she's one of our amazing mentees. It seems a good time to say thank you to our mentees who've been brilliant, and our mentors. Sophie's one of our mentors, as are some of the other women on the call, I know. So a big thank you. Please do continue the debate using the hashtag WEN Cafe, and input your ideas. I'm sorry if we missed your question, very difficult to get through everybody's. But also, can I ask you to fill out our Survey Monkey? It's very quick, but it's really important to us so we can continue funding this kind of event and putting on this kind of thing. Noreen is so right. For us at WEN, it's just been wonderful to connect with people all over Wales once a month on a different subject and really thrash out some ideas, which we always take forward and put to Welsh Government and other policymakers, so that we really try and change the debate and move things forward. So diolch yn fawr, everyone. Have a great day, and thank you all for coming, and thanks especially to Michelle for chairing. Thank you.